The first presentation will be by Dr. Larry Bramlage on test trends in thoroughbred racing. Dr. Bramlage, as you all know, is a very well-renowned orthopedic surgeon, former president of the AAP, and it's a pleasure to introduce him today. Dr. Bramlage.
Thanks, Ed. I'm going to try to lay out what we know and then a few things of what we think, and I'll try to make it clear about the actual facts and where there's an opinion came in. All this data started out as a subcommittee of the KTA after a meeting at the end of 2003, extending into 2004, and then as Ed said, we used this information at a meeting last year in April. There is no one statistic that best talks about what we're talking about here today, so when we started looking at this thing, the four people that, plus myself that I showed initially, we had to develop something that we could look at, and we did that by taking the total starts by all horses born in a year over the number of horses born during that year and coming up with a statistic called North American average lifetime starts per crop year. So that way you could look at what's happened year by year over the time frame, and we'll look at this graph in a bit more detail here in a minute. The second thing we did is took the total years raced by all horses born in a year divided by the number of horses born that year. So this gave a statistic that we called average years raced. You have to remember that when you do this, the influences that you're looking at are going to happen in, let's say, year 3 of the horse's race career, but the horse will be listed on the year that he's born. So I'll point that out a couple of times as we go. And the second thing is I'm sorry about the numbers being all jumbled. I originally wrote this thing on a Mac, and the transfer changes just a few things, but I don't think there's anything of substance. You can see that the two plots are similar, but related. They're somewhat different, and I'm going to point out major differences or significant differences as we go along between the two. The next thing we thought was interesting would be to look at the same statistic, average lifetime starts, for North America, England, Ireland, France, Japan, and Australia. As you can see, the only two places that have enough data that we could easily use, in addition to the United States, were England and Ireland. North America has a precipitous at times but gradual decline over the time frame from approximately 1940 until the current time. Interestingly, England and Ireland remain pretty much the same in average career lifetime starts in the mid-teens, and so what we talk about as being a marked decline in the United States, we still haven't reached the same level as England and Ireland. Japan is considerably lower, and France is someplace in between the England and Ireland and U.S. data. When you look at average years raced, there's a significant difference in North America in that in the late 70s, there was a significant decline in the average years raced compared to the other countries, and so that we'll come back to that. So the question comes up, is this a chicken or an egg? In other words, does the average years raced drive the average number of starts or vice versa? Well, if you give it to a statistician, which we did, the statistician is perfectly clear that the drop in years raced is the driver of these two statistics in North America. That drop that I showed you, which we'll come back to in the late 70s, is more important than the other way around. At some time approximately there, a significant influence occurred that drove the years raced in the United States down. The average number of starts declined continuously during that time, but there was a marked decline in the late 70s in the average years raced by North American crops. And again, I'm sorry for the writing, but this is the Mac PC transfer. Then, somewhere about 1986, that decline reversed, and the average number of years raced went back the other way. Average lifetime starts followed, but I'll talk about that in more in concern in a minute. So how can we look at where did the influences occur? The most important thing to assess is the slope of the line. Slopes of the line indicate major changes, and we'll come back to each of these one at a time, but this is the most precipitous drop. So we started out concentrating our efforts to look at the statistical connections in the time frame from the late 70s until the mid-80s. Any time before, from the time of World War II back, we didn't really do much there. That's the same. It's a relatively small number of thoroughbreds if you look at the total numbers racing, and the geopolitical climate is considerably more stable from World War II forward. And if you go to the end of the data, you'll see that this is not a precipitous activity of any kind. It mostly represents the fact that the horses that are involved in that data, as I said initially, are still racing, or were still racing. This is 2003 data, which was the current year we pulled in 2004. So that line will come back up to some level because the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds will still be adding starts to this data, so that's pretty much useless there on the tail end. We'll have to concentrate our efforts in between. So looking at this slope where there was a marked decline, that's where we gathered as much information as we could and sent it off to the statistician. And these are the things that the Jockey Club had readily available. Races available, purses available, total number of dollars, number of starters, percent of the foal crop that raced, the number of foals born, and the average yearling price. That was available in computerized database. When we sent it off to the statistician, the opinion came back that anything that I've got up there in green is not related. The two items that are in yellow are related to the decline in average year starts, average years raced, and therefore indirectly to the average number of starts. I'll come back to that in a minute. We then did a cohort analysis, which means you just take 3-year segments and average them and look at what's happening during those 3-year periods of time. So unlike the previous information, we're not looking at the dots here, we're looking at the lines. And the lines tell you what's happening during those segments. And segments of interest, as I said, the segment of World War II and before is probably not very useful for us. We're going to look at everything from about 1950 on. If you look at the mid portion of the segment, there's an area where everything seemed to plateau. The influences would have been up in order to make the lines plateau. And then from the 1986-88 segment forward, there's a pretty significant push for the number of years raced and lifetime starts to go back up. I'll get back to this at the end, but if you look at the information, it's a comparison from 3-year segment to 3-year segment in what happens in each 3-year segment. That's the slope, that's those lines and their slope. Now it's possible to take the information and pull out the influence of the average years raced on the total number of starts. So the blue line's the total number of starts. If we pulled out the influence of the average years raced, remember the statistician said the average years raced is the driver, so you subtract that influence, we still have a gradual decline, but the decline is, if you go all the way back to about 1950, about 2/3 of the decline initially and half of it in later years is accounted for by this driver of decrease in the average lifetime of a thoroughbred racehorse. Then there are other influences which we didn't identify that are represented by the pink line, and everything is plotted against the end of the useful data that we had, which is about 1997. And so it's relative in number of starts on the left-hand side here. Number of starts decline. And as you can see, from 1950 on, the number of starts declined about 23 starts per horse. And you can account for a big percentage of that by the decline in average years raced. What about medication? That always comes up. There's no statistic we can apply, but information-wise, this was about the time that phenylbutazone became available and widespread from Gensal. It came in a little bit earlier than that, but for common adoption's sake, That is about the time when the common use of it in 1965 would have been available at the racetrack. It kind of eased in for the previous 5 years. If you look at that, we'd have to look at the years born. In the green arrow, that's the year that the horses that were first getting phenylbutazone, the earliest crops, would have been born. And so if you're talking about medication, and you're talking about, you have to divide it into two effects. One would be, if you're talking about the decline in the strength of the horse, strength of the breed, that's something that we can't look at directly. You'd have to find some sort of indirect measure of which we haven't identified yet. But if you're looking at the fact that if you give a horse medication, does it shorten their career? In actual fact, the statistics don't support that. In fact, unless there's a better explanation for the plateau, it may be involved in the plateau in average number of starts when it arrived. Now, I know that I'm subject to tomatoes and oranges because I am a veterinarian, but the data does not show there was a precipitous drop with the advent of phenylbutazone. What about this plateau that's late in the career? Or late in the graph, this is the one where if you look at it, the graph that I had of the cohort study, the pressure went back up for horses to stay in training during that period of time. Well, the tax law changes in '86, yearling price declined and the number of foals declined all at about the same time. They probably are interrelated. As to which one is exactly which, we're not sure. The statistician's assessment of the data we sent him is that it's a simple economic model, that when a horse's second career becomes worth more than his first career, the horse switches careers. And that the statistical connection exists because the price of yearlings drives down the number of years raced and drives up the number of foals. And that number of foals then drives down the number of starts per foal. So we looked at that a little closer. This is the average yearling price through that last segment of data, and as you can see, there's nearly a direct inverse in the average yearling price and the number of starts made by, or number of years raced by North American thoroughbreds. This is the number of foals. The foal crop rose from 1976 until 2002, rose more than 100%, or it doubled. And people are fond of quoting statistics from 1950. If you go all the way back to 1950, there's more than a 500% increase in the number of thoroughbred foals registered. So the number of races available for those foals went up about 15% in approximately 1990, and then declined again to levels below 1976. So if you try to race all those horses in the same number of races, either the number of starters per race must go up or the number of starts per horse must go down. That's the only way you can do that. Contrary to popular opinion, the size of fields, this is a slide courtesy of Ed Bowen from our April meeting, that shows that though the average number of starters per race has gone down about 3/4 of a horse, there's not a precipitous decline in the number of starters per race. It stays relatively steady around the 8 to 9 horses per race, and the data that you have gotten in your packet is supportive of this. If you look at the foals crops as opposed to the number of years, or the average starters, you can see it's a pretty good match in inverse proportions to that area, but one of the things we might have to look at here is in the recent past, in the 1990s, why, when the foal numbers went down, did the foal crops not come back up to the same amount? It certainly came, the number of starts came up, but when the foal price goes down, following all the rest of the data, you would have expected the number of starts per horse to come up more than it did. Is there a difference in the sexes? This gets to the question of, do you retire the fillies to the breeding shed and then influence the population of fillies, because most of the colts are going to be geldings by that time, they're going to continue racing. In actual fact, they're pretty much parallel, so the influence is more not what goes from the track to the breeding shed, but what comes out of the breeding shed going to the track. Because when you retire those horses, they're going to produce males and females alike, and they're going to compete for the same races. This again is another slide courtesy of Ed that shows the decline is across all classes of horses in the years 1994 to 2004. The decline in the number of starts crosses all classes. It's not preferential. So we appear to give up on a horse and go to the next horse faster, and one of the questions is this due to injury? I don't know, but this is what we do know. The average year's race is going down, or has gone down, climbed again recently. Statistically, that can be shown to be related to yearling price, increased number of foals, and average number of starts. The average year's race affects all of those. And by extrapolation, this increased competition of horses for races is going to create a cyclic, perpetuating cycle that should be broken by the law of supply and demand when the increased number of foals drives the yearling price back down and then decreases the number of foals. But in fact, it does not break the cycle because there's a disconnect between the racetrack earning potential and the yearling price in the North American thoroughbreds. Increased competition for races. Why did the number of starters not go up? Well, perhaps there's not a lot of demand for it to be 30 to 1 on the morning line. We might scratch out easier and run in a few days. And if you're not very productive as a horse, we're going to take your stall for somebody else. And another question that we couldn't address is, what about the genetic longevity of a horse's race career? Well, we'll breed anything to anything if they're fast enough and have a pedigree. And when you breed short careers to injured horses, why should you expect longevity? So what are we going to do about that, about this whole scenario? That's what we're here to find out. That's what you're here to let us know. So, Rick, I think you're up.